Total Logic and the University of Life. Chapter 13, The Bullies. I walked over slow, straightening out my back and rubbing the thick part of my upper thigh to rejuvenate the blood flow. I had been sitting for quite a while, and a slight cramp was starting to form in my left leg. The sky was clear, and the calm breeze blew across my face as I started out with a slight limp towards the blue building. Then I saw him. Seated elegantly on a large, low-hanging branch was the eagle. He was just looking around, scanning the area with his deep black eyes. I approached curiously, slow as I went, trying hard not to disturb the great bird as it was perched on a thick branch. I got close, about 3 feet in front of him. Then, with a quick snap of his neck, he turned and positioned himself dead ahead of me, staring into my eyes with an intense look reserved for the gravest of situations. I just froze there, waiting for his move. "Whose is this?" he said to me. "Whose is this?" he said again. I looked around. I didn't know what the great bird was talking about. "Whose is what?" I said to myself as I spun a bit, looking for some stray object he may have been referring to. I knew it had been something important, though. I knew it had to be something I was supposed to hear and understand in some way. This was the eagle, after all, and he was talking to me. So I looked closer into his eyes. "Whose is this?" I asked. "My thought or your thought?" the eagle quickly said back to me. "Whose is this, my thought or your thought?" he said again. He then raised his white beak and looked up towards the sun. Then he flapped his massive wings and flew off. I stood there stunned for a moment, but only for a short moment, for I knew my next class was about to start soon. "Whose is this, my thought or your thought?" I said to myself as I rushed across the lawn. I didn't really know what it meant, but I kept saying to myself, I didn't want to lose the idea as I strained to understand it. I ran up the steps and through the main door of the large blue building across the way. As I entered the building, I stopped. The interior was stark and open, painted in a robin egg blue with tall ceilings, large open beams. It had hard granite tile floors. I found myself alone in there. A little panic came to my thoughts. There were so many rooms, so many signs, no one to ask. I reached into my upper pocket and pulled out my crumpled list of courses once more. Thereupon the paper was written the words, "Are you a controller?" "Sure you are." Then came a slight tap on my shoulder. "Arthur, thank God you're here." "Yes, sir, yes, here," he said to me. "Is there anything I can help you with? Can I be able of any service to you, sir?" I looked at him. "I'm just not sure where to go. There are no directions on this list for the next class. Look here, where do I go next?" "Well, let's see," as he took a list from my hand and read it softly in a quiet and refined English voice to himself. "Sir, all the controller classes are set at your discretion. This means you can pick any classroom you like. Any one of them will be the right one. You control it, sir. You see, there is always magic working here at the core of all the courses and classrooms choices you may make or be directed to. You cannot make a wrong decision here. There are only the valid choices that you can, an individual working from your own universe, can make. No matter what choice you make, it will be valid one for you at the time you make it. So go ahead. You can go into any room you like, sir." "Anyone I like?" "Yes, sir." So I walked over across the hallway, slowly at first, thinking to myself to pick just the right classroom and tormented by the fact that it really didn't matter. This concept really screwed with my basic understanding of reality. After a minute or two of dysfunctional thought, I proceeded into the last classroom on the right. This was the one just above the gardens that would eventually take me back through the university grounds to the main building and hopefully to a nice dinner later. I walked in and sat down in my seat. Then Alfred appeared soon after. "So what's up?" he said in a quick, pointed tone as he walked into the room, glazing off into the back of the room as if welcoming all that had attended the class. I looked at my class sheet. There, now written in bold red ink, was the word bully. This class, I concluded, was to be a class on bullies. Alfred then seated himself. "We are now entering the notion of autonomy," he said as he handed out a piece of paper. It was a flyer that he wanted me to read. I looked at it and I read it. It said this: Two people approach reality. They experience it. They come away with different experiences. They cannot share reality as they do not have it, but they can share their experience of reality for those they have. Sadly, they often argue over whose experience is right, who has the right experience. It is as though you and I went to a beautiful national park for the weekend. We each took a video camera and took pictures all weekend. Then we came back. When we came back, we have two sets of tape. Then we get into an argument over whose tape had the right pictures. Foolishly, we keep one tape and hide the other. After we should treasure both. And remember, if you want to know what you look like in the world, you need to look at my tape. And if I want to know how I come across, I need to look at your tape. Alfred then sighed. As I finished reading, I looked up to see the turtle looking down at me, and he began to speak. A challenge, I believe, that faces a couple or a group needing to make decisions is avoiding the dysfunction form of hierarchy. Fortunately, functional and dysfunctional differ readily and can be identified practically. I think they can even be measured. Unfortunately, I believe the dysfunctional hierarchy is the most common form of relating in the human culture. Thus, I see the solution to the challenge as a simple but almost constant effort. Often, talking well is just a matter of how we speak, the syntax and the semantics. I believe the more critical piece of semantics is the clarity of ownership. Whose is it? My thought or your thought? And there it was. That's what the eagle had just handed me. At times, Alfred tended to speak over my head, as he just did in that last exchange of words. Dysfunctional hierarchy? Clarity of ownership? What the hell was he talking about? But the words, whose is this? My thought or your thought? That I could understand. I believe I get what you're talking about, I shouted. It's about taking responsibility for your own words and thoughts, I said out loud. Yes, Alfred interjection. Clarity of ownership. Whose is this? My thought or your thought? In a functional hierarchy, each partner takes responsibility for their side. You see, arguing is a waste of time and energy. As I see it, the purpose of a functional hierarchy is to provide a successful compromise between the group's need for decisions and the valuable diversity of opinion present in the group, while the purpose of dysfunctional hierarchy is obedience. Dialogue, because of its rich flow of data, is the form of communication in a functional hierarchy. Master talk, because of its acuity of discovering and surfacing trends of disobedience, is the form of communication in the dysfunctional hierarchy. Dialogue involves the joining of two or more points of view into a larger and more complete view of the world. Dialogue is a collegiate way of talking. Points of view are shared and added to other points of view. For the making of quality decisions, dialogue is highly desired. Maintaining clarity of ownership is a key element. It is the boundary that is required when involved in such a dialogue. Master talking centers around the competition of points of view. Its purpose is to ensure the dominance of a single view, then with ensuring the extinguishing of other points of view. I thought back to the Valley of the Masters. I could see what the turtle was trying to tell me. I clearly remember the horror of the Masters as they pranced around the dark countryside in the valley, how they tried to dominate each other. That was all they had, and that held their world together, the dominance of each other, of one another. It was a world I did not want to visit again, but was I already living in one, was the question. I sat there in the turtle's classroom, just looking down at the crumpled piece of paper that listed all of my classes in my hand. I just kept staring at the words written on the piece of paper, the word bully. Then the turtle broke my thoughts and proceeded to speak once again. Probably 70% of couples I see along the path have controlling as a problem. What is it? How does it work? What can you do about it? In this class, I will try to answer those questions and share solutions with you. Let's start with the definition, said the turtle, and he proceeded to turn and write on the blackboard the following words. A controller is a person whose nervous system has been affected in childhood in such a way that they get nervous, upset, panicky when things are out of place, and who spends much of their time trying to relax. When something's out of place, the nervous system of a controller starts to react. It's pretty simple. They have difficulty dealing with normal chaos, and they are just trying to calm down by doing something or fixing something. As far as I know, everyone is a controller to some extent, some more or less, and I never blame controllers. When I see a couple along the path for the first meeting, I will often test for this issue. If they mention anything like doing it right or wrong, then I want to know how strong the problem is. What I do is I slide some rocks and leaves out into the path from the side. I make a mess. I then watch their blood pressures. Usually, this rise in tension is pretty easy to see. I then ask the one I am talking to, who do you think would be bothered by this more, you or your partner? Having watched them, I've already seen who it bothers. A sudden jump in blood pressure is pretty visible. I compare their spoken answers with what I have observed about their changes in tension, their nonverbal answers. Sometimes a person whose blood pressure soared will say that it doesn't matter to them at all. Then I can gather not only that they have a challenge of controlling, but they also have a challenge of telling the truth. Well, it gives me a starting place anyway. What I have learned is that controllers are trained starting around the age of 3. At this age, a child would typically try to talk with their caretakers, their parents that is, about how they see things uniquely different. If the parents or caretakers are curious and good at listening, ideally, if they mirror the child, then the child's brain develops rapidly and eventually this contributes to a firm sense of self. On the other hand, if the caretakers criticize, judge, contradict, etc., then the child shifts from developing its sense of self and begins a never-ending search for being right, being correct according to someone outside themselves. Mommy, did I do this right? Daddy, am I right? The stronger the critical teaching, the stronger the child learns to react to thinking or acting out of place. The more the controller they become. Simply put, critical controlling parents produce critically controlling children who grow up and eventually find a partner. A controller, you see, is bothered by things out of place or out of order. This may not necessarily be a problem. Copy editors, quality control inspectors, accountants, auditors, brain surgeons, and others are paid for their noticing things out of place. The training of a controller, the reactions of their nervous system, is helpful in many professions. However, controlling can be a serious problem. After all, for a person with this training, their nervous system reacts without their wishing it. Controlling can be a pain in the neck for a person who has it. The stronger they were trained in childhood, the stronger the effect. The rise in tension, the bigger the mess. The worse the rise in their blood pressure. A strongly trained controller can simply pass out if put into a lot of chaos. If the individual lives alone, controlling can usually be managed as the person just straightens things up and keeps them out of the way. But if they live with someone, this can get into being a big problem, especially as the other person may make creative messes. This usually generates a great problem. Who determines what is the correct definition of rightness or neatness? What do you do what do you do about what I call rebellion? The purposeful, sometimes unconscious tendency to make a mess or do the wrong thing. So, rule number 1, Alfred asked like a question and turned to the board and then wrote, controllers are people who attempt to relax themselves by getting and keeping things in place. When faced with what they think is a mess or chaos, they get nervous. This habit was trained into them from childhood, usually by one or more of their controlling caretakers. Now, Mrs. Turtle and I identify the elements of what a controller is by focusing upon it. We call them rules. A rule is a way of doing something or a place for something when a rule is followed And when a rule is followed, a controller relaxes. Here are some examples. A kitchen cupboard door should be shut. People should not drive faster than speed limit. Computers should be carefully shut down when not in use. Smile when you shake someone's hand. Sit straight at the table. Turn off the water while you brush your teeth. Clean your nose with a handkerchief. At night, lights should be turned off in rooms when you leave. Rules are specific to each controller, Alfred continued. Each controller uses their own set of rules. Each controller has their own set of rules. What sounds like, this is the way things should be, is really, if things are this way, I will be happy. Everyone seems to have some rules. Some people seem to have a great many rules, also seem to have very general rules. The part of a person that gets tense, the lizard, doesn't seem to notice who is breaking the rule, just that someone is. I recall once listening to a wife being critical about drivers. I noticed my stomach muscles tensing. I was anticipating that she might criticize me. Actually, she didn't. Later that day, I found myself criticizing someone else and noticed that my same stomach muscles were tensing. Criticism made me nervous, whether I did it or she did it. My rule was don't be critical. One day, Mrs. Turtle and I sat down. Actually, it was in the summer, and we sat in a stream and compared our rules. I thought of as many rules as I could. Mrs. Turtle struggled a few more that she thought I had as well. Then she listed her rules, and I added to her list. Then we compared our list. This was quite instructive. And here is what we found. Two people's rules are in no way the same. There is no way that I would have the same rules that she would have. I was raised differently. There may be commonly held rules, but the details of these rules will seem quite different. This is a problem with the idea of common sense. To me, the phrase common sense refers to rules that many people seem to share. The problem occurs when I think that my common sense rules are the same as yours. They aren't. This is another situation where getting used to the differences between us, validation and pre-validation, really helps. So, many people foolishly imagine that people have the same set of rules. You see, rules produce rebels. When I was a very little turtle, my mother had many rules. Along the way, I learned to assert my difference from her, my uniqueness, by developing some rebelling habits. A rebelling habit is a tendency to do something against someone else's rule. It could be a big rebellion against a large rule or a small rebellion against a small rule. While the function of these rebellions was probably originally to assert uniqueness, the current result of the rebellion is typically to produce stress in the rule holder and in the relationship. I think it might be fun to list all the rules you don't like following that you rebel against. Rebels often show their tendency to fight back in what is called passive-aggressive behavior. For example, almost all lateness is a hidden form of rebellion. I've often said that my first wife was late to everything. What drove this aggravating behavior, I thought? I've learned it was a glorious streak of rebellion, probably initiated against her controlling dad or mom. The interesting thing is, you will often marry someone who rebels against your rules. This is a fun discovery, and might be more often true than I've seen. It is quite possible that one of the things that makes for committed partnerships is a tendency for one person to rebel in the area of the other person's rules and vice versa. For example, Mrs. Turtle has a rule about keeping kitchen cabinet doors closed, and I habitually leave the cabinets open. My rebellion directly conflicts with her rule. I am very careful when I shut the computer, while Mrs. Turtle's tendency is to flip off the circuit breaker. Her rebellion strikes directly at my rule. I fear walking through deep water puddles, as the water may get into my shell. Mrs. Turtle loves running as fast as she can through water puddles. The deeper the better. You see, rules are learned. Where do these rules come from? What do you think? They seem to be learned at the feet of your parents and other teachers who tell or show you their rules. They often act to children as if their rules are the right rules. As in what we have learned in Master Talk class, having looked at a lot of people's rules, here are some thoughts. For the most part, people don't examine the rules they have, and most children commonly follow other people's rules without deciding whether they like them or not. This lack of what I call self-reference, this lack of even noticing one's own thinking or values, is a central issue in self-esteem or other esteem. I define self-esteem as liking yourself even while others hate you. I define other esteem as liking yourself only if others like you. The same holds true with rules. I believe self-rules are the rules that I have chosen to live by. Other rules are the rules other people gave me, and I have not even considered whether I would choose those rules. Now, since breaking rules makes a person tense and following a rule relaxes them, people will tend to follow whatever rules they have at a given time, self-rules or other rules. Most very active controllers are working so hard to follow the rules they have that they have never stopped to consider what rules they like and what they want to get rid of or change. You see, controllers relax when their rules are followed. When things happen according to their instruction, they have accepted as being right. This is not a conscious effort, but is more an unconscious reality, a habit. If you or they do something outside their rules, adrenaline will flow and their bloodstream and their blood pressure will rise. They try to relax by following and trying to get you to follow their rules. Controllers are generally not very happy people. The more powerful this drive has been trained into a person, the more often their nervous system becomes active. Adrenaline is not a particularly pleasant drug. Being tense isn't fun. When a controller is alone, still they are seeing things out of place or things that need to be done. Most controllers are very tense almost all the time. When others are around, the whole effect gets multiplied. A controller can easily overload too much stress. The verbal form of controlling is called criticism. When a controller notes something out of place, they often speak out loud. Who moved that chair? That's not the right word. Your hair needs cutting. Where did you get that kind of thing? I've learned that inside the mind of a controller, such observations are almost constant. Some of them are spoken out loud, the ones that others hear. These comments are often like criticisms, judgments, or even orders. I don't think that it is what they really are. I think they're just normal ramblings of the mind of a controller, noticing things out of place. So what to do? What do you do? Says the turtle. Well, if you are a controller, and we all are to some extent, I suggest you learn about your rules and re-examine them. Some rules you may find to be really valuable. Don't put your finger in a light socket when it's turned on. Drive to the right in the United States. Other rules may be silly and useless. No singing at the dining room table, for example. Talk your rules over with your partner to get a firm sense that your rules are yours and not necessarily theirs. If you tend to push others to follow your rules, this is normal. It probably is just an attempt to gain a sense of peace of mind. However, it doesn't work. Not only do people resist you, but they learn to avoid and dislike you. This is basic master-slave stuff. Instead, learn the ways of friend-friend. Learn how to be a friend. Learn to know when you get overloaded with too many rules being broken. Knowing how many rules you have might be important. This is about you and your training, not about other people. Take care of yourself by having a clean, quiet place to go in order to refresh yourself. If you are the partner of a controller, and we all are to some extent, I suggest you learn to mirror your partner's critical sending statements. This protects you from the sound of an order and lets your partner know what they sound like. So, you think the chair should be over there. Did I get that? What do you want to do about it? Learn how much distress and chaos is in your partner's lot in life. Help them. Don't obey them. Help them build a place of peace. Learn to validate and learn about safety. Remember, the lizard needs safety. I know one guy who counts his wife's critical comments. If there are more than 3 in a minute, he shifts to helping her feel calmer. He assumes she is pretty stressed. Hey, hon, what can I do to help you feel safer and more at peace? He has learned that when his wife gets really distressed, he can always help by offering to clean the house with her. Getting the house clean isn't as important as his just expressing willingness to help. You see, the big problem is managing tension. It all goes back to the issue of safety. I believe controllers and their partners, and which is sometimes to be confusing, must become experts at dealing with anxiety, tension, and panic. Since their training makes any chaos to erupt in the flow of adrenaline and all its consequences in the body, stress is something these people will be living with. I've learned that a controller can become stressed out just by driving past someone else's front yard that is messy. Thus, all the tactics of stress reduction become vital. I think it is very important to be familiar with your own level of stress and also easily able to read your partner's level of stress. If you have to, take courses on stress management. I think you have no choice. Learn to take the time outs when either of you feel overloaded with stress or you think your partner is overloaded with stress. One of the big problems is falling out of dialogue, not talking. Since this challenge facing controls is physical, that is, a trained reaction of the nervous system, I found that they can easily think that others have the same reactions to the same things. This tendency to think that others are just like us is sometimes called emotional symbiosis. Remember what we have talked about that. This is the opposite of being dialogical, of talking. It is extremely important that a controller learn and that their partner remind them that other people are different, have different rules and different reactions. This is all about boundaries. You have all visited the castle of boundaries. Go back to it in your mind if you have to. Build your own castle and be safe inside of it. Try this for an example. A controller says people should not wear hats in a restaurant. Their partner should respond, I hear that's a rule for you. I certainly see lots of people think wearing hats are just fine. A controller might say, I have to get my Christmas cards out earlier this year. Oh, Christmas card sending is one of my rules. I think I have to send them. I bet the card stores like me. As part of this retaining, I want the partner to mirror the controller, validate them, and speak of their own differences. I think you need to do this over and over again. Another example could be a controller says, the bed has to be made every morning. The partner responds, I hear you believe it sounds like you believe beds should be made in the morning. I bet it makes you uncomfortable to see beds unmade later in the day. Heck, I don't even notice this. Let's go make the bed now. Controller says, aren't roller coasters so scary? Partner responds, I hear that roller coasters scare you. I actually enjoy going on a roller coaster. Isn't it fun to be different? I certainly wouldn't try to get you to go on one, but would you wait a minute while I take a ride? Here's another example. Controller says, this is the way to do this. Partner responds, so you like to do it that way. I prefer to do it a different way. So we're just different. That's cool. My thoughts at this point took me right back into the Valley of the Masters once again. I almost lost my life in that valley, remember? This is what it was all about. The way I battled them and finally got free. It was all about the dialogue, converting the master to a friend through mirroring. Alfred then continued. Another big problem is the danger of obedience and bullying. I think this is the biggest problem. While a controller is simply trying to relax, they often try to get other people to cooperate and help. This can be easily take the form of persuasion, manipulation, coercion, and outright bullying. This polarizes the couple into winners and losers or into contestants in arguing. This is extremely dangerous for both. Truth to tell, I do not know who I think is more responsible for this horrible but common situation, the one who bullies or the one who gives in. Either way, resentment grows in both members of the relationship. I thought again to myself, the slave was the one who was controlling all the masters in the valley. I remember how she came and she said, "Come fill me, I am empty." And all the masters went over to her and barked out orders and demands. She needed it. She seemed to thrive on that. It wasn't until the battle took place, until I finally converted her into take responsibility, that she broke the need to be controlled, to submit. That's when she disappeared, and I was free as well. I looked up to the turtle as he continued his lecture. It was all starting to make a little more sense now. Here's an example of this, the turtle continued. I met a husband recently who said that his wife demanded that their whole house had to be kept spotless. His stuff was not allowed anywhere in the house, not even his pictures or his deer heads on the wall. He said to me, "I can't live in a little I can't even have a little space for myself." I asked him why he had let his partner take over so much. Just because she had the ability to bully on demand didn't mean that she should get away with it. It was his job to make sure she only got her part of the situation and he got his. By giving up completely, being so passive, he had turned her into a monster. Not very loving of him. My suggestion is that neither partner ever accept obedience. If you are a controller, don't accept it when your partner says yes, dear, and looks submissive. Change this. Dialogue about it. If you are the partner of a controller, there is nothing wrong with doing what your partner wants, because it will help them calm down. It will help them make it will help to make you feel generous. But never do it if you feel you have to, and it isn't one of your rules. Again, we covered this in Master Slave. Don't let this happen. Determine to move to friend-friend and stay there. As I've said before, controllers are people who get into distress when they see disorder. Thus, they get tense a lot. They cannot help this. It was taught to them in childhood and is part of who they are. They can deal with it. You can deal with it. Since we all are controllers to some extent, I think it best to learn to lovingly understand yourself and your partner. I remember the Rumpkel mystery series where the hero called his wife "she who must be obeyed." This always sounded so distressful. I met a guy who called his wife "she who see things out of place." This seems a little bit better. I love your human movie As Good as It Gets with Jack Nicholson and Helen Hunt. It's a wonderful loving look at the challenges facing controllers. This all reminds me of the great story I've told many times on Short Tempers and What They Earn You. It goes something like this. Alfred proceeded to tell his story. There was once a man called Jack. Now, this is a true story as I remember it. Its spirit is intact even if some of the details have been slightly altered and the names haven't been changed. I knew Jack, you see, Alfred said. Jack was a short, wiry fellow, quick of eye. He loved hunting and fishing. He also loved his wife and his daughters. He had three. A hard worker, he spent most of his life in the forest driving a cat and wrestling trees for a lumber company. I gather this is one of the most dangerous of all professions, next to the professional fishing off the coast of Alaska or New England. Jack was generally cheerful, full of stories, and helpful. In his later years, he lived near a fishing lake and helped people rent rowboats and catch their limit. Jack had a short temper. He learned as a boy to meet adversity with anger. He got angry at things that wouldn't work right. He got angry when things broke down. He got angry when things were late or slow. But mostly he got angry with people who did not do things his way. Jack was, in the best sense of the word, a classic bully. Not that he would have called himself that, but when people disagreed with his way, his anger would flare. As a youth, his anger was expressed in fistfights, physical violence, and throwing things as well as yelling. But as he mellowed, Jack learned to use more gentle means of getting his point across. A glance, a stare, a sudden getting up and walking away, and finally a snapping gesture with his right hand and a click of his tongue where all he needed when I met him near his 70th birthday. Of course, his family had mellowed with him. His wife had always been quite quiet even before she met Jack. His actions were similar to his father's. She had proceeded to teach their daughters to hold themselves in and to avoid upsetting Jack. This glare, that glare, or that hand gesture and tongue click was all Jack needed within his family. Loving the outdoors, his greatest fear was getting old and being put in a nursing home, physically helpless, and so in his senior life, he lived with his wife in a trailer near the lake. Moving to an assisted living home when he was 80 and his eyesight was failing was a great trial for Jack. Then, one day, in his 80s, Jack had a mild stroke. Rushed to a local hospital, and the doctors did what they could, but most of the recovery was up to Jack. He lay in the hospital bed, immobile. He could not even get his eyes to move down to see the TV on the wall. I guess this is pretty normal after a stroke. Two of his daughters came in. They spoke to him. They adjusted his pillow. Jack said and did nothing. They ran out of things to say. After a while, they began talking to each other in front of Jack, realizing that this was the first time in their lives that they had ever spoken freely in his presence. Surprised them. They began talking more and more about what it was and had been like to have to be on guard in front of Dad. They talked of their fear of him and how it was to grow up with a father that had rages at them, their dog or whatever that wasn't pleasing him. One daughter remembered him telling how he would fling the thick frosting from his cake into the woods when he was at work because he didn't like the goofy stuff. This was especially hurtful to her since she had learned to work hard to please him all the time, cooking for him, baking what she thought were his favorite desserts. They spoke of their memories of how he had dragged their third sister downstairs to the basement and gave her a spanking, and how they still remembered her yelling at their father and crying in fear. They discussed how nice it was in between these rages, how nice he was in between the rages. They said that when they were little, they never knew when it would come, his being displeased with things. Their talk got them to look over at their father, not responding to the conversation. One sister remarked how angry he would have been to just be lying there, not being able to control the situation with his body or even to stop them talking like this. She said about how it would be so easy to just slip some air into the intravenous tube and then he wouldn't wake up mad. She then suggested there might be other ways to help him along. Their thoughts scared him. They became silent to calm themselves and withdraw. Later that afternoon, the two daughters brought in Jack, his wife, Peggy. Peggy was in a wheelchair and sat there looking at Jack for some time. Finally, she asked, "Can he do anything?" They said, No, he can't do anything." She asked again, and they confirmed that he could not move. Then she, with all her resentment, suddenly surfaced and said, "Get me away from this disgusting thing," and they all left. Now, you might want to know something that Jack's wife and daughters did not. A person recovering from a stroke may not be able to move, but often their hearing works perfectly. Jack had heard everything, and it was the first time in his life that he had gotten to hear what his loved ones thought of him. It was the first time his display of temper had not kept them quiet. "I met Jack 2 days later," said Alfred, "in a rehabilitation unit where he had been transferred as he began to get conscious control of his muscles. He looked at me and spoke. I could not hear, so I leaned close. His words were, does the women I live with love me?" I knew about the family fairly well. I had heard from one of the daughters about what had been said before him in the hospital bed. I knew of Jack's temper, and I knew of the family silence. I was also in the presence of a man, a person deserving of respect, a man who might meet his maker at any second. Did I give him my truth, or did I just say the expecting thing? I made my decision. I said no to him. She fears you. A long sigh of recognition escaped Jack. He nodded his head, and then he wept. I sat with him for a long time. As Jack recovered more and more, he moved into another rehabilitation unit connected to a nursing home. Jack wanted to go home. He wanted his wife. He wanted that trailer by the fishing lake. The medication the doctor prescribed for his stroke aggravated his temper, lowered his self-control. He began to physically and verbally strike out at people, staff, nurses, and doctors. I was there when his wife was brought in to visit him. He moved his wheelchair over next to hers, held onto her tightly. She looked frightened. The nurse moved them apart. He kicked at the nurse and yelled, "I want to go home." He threw things. The social worker who was standing there spoke to me shortly thereafter. "We can't let him go home to his wife. She and he couldn't handle it." At the advice of the doctor, Jack was given calming medication. He continued to struggle and fight for several weeks. He was even aggressive towards other patients. After more calming medication, Jack was moved to a nursing home that could handle his outbursts. 1 year later, Jack passed away in bed after a year living out the nightmare that he had wanted to avoid all his life. And yet, I wanted to be clear. Jack had earned this. This was his retirement program. Every time he used his temper at someone, he invested in their resentment. Every time he interrupted, yelled, overruled, scared his wife and children, he was earning their future anger in return. That retirement program didn't show until he badly needed caring from his loved ones. At that point, his account was empty. He got exactly what he had earned, day in and day out, year in, year out. I have to look at these things. I am just that kind of turtle. I hate to miss a lesson that is passed to me. What I had witnessed was a tragedy, a terrible one. How could it have been avoided? At first I thought about who could have done something different. Well, Jack could. Well, could Jack? No. He didn't know what his investment program was. When he was a kid, this behavior of his was normal. His dad did it. At work, many people acted that way. Many fathers, mothers, friends acted that way. Who could have told him what he was earning? Could his wife and his daughters? No. His wife was thoroughly intimidated long before she met him. Besides, his behavior was familiar to her, being the same as her father. She didn't know anything to say. His daughters were trained as children to say nothing. The whole family acted out the rule. If you can't say anything nice, say nothing. Thus Jack earned his reward daily and without contradiction. So could his friends have told him what he was earning? Well, what is a friend if not someone who can tell you when you are heading into trouble? Yes, I think this friend could have and should have warned him, and thus earned the name friend, but they didn't. I like Jack. In many ways, he was a very nice guy. I'm sorry I didn't learn his lesson earlier, the one he would teach me with his life, until after his passing, and I hope I would have had the courage to tell him. About a year after Jack's passing, I was at a family dinner gathering. One of Jack's daughters was there with her grown son and his daughter. 3 generations after Jack sat at that table. At one point, the little girl, about 8, said something to which her dad responded with a click of his fingers and a sht sound from his mouth. A warning. I immediately thought of Jack's snap of the right hand and the click of his tongue. The girl's grandmother, Jack's daughter, and the young man's mother said, "Oh, let her be, she's okay," to which Jack's grandson responded with the same click of his fingers and the sh sound. Everyone at the table was silent for a moment, and then dinner continued as if nothing had happened. The next day, I told the young man the story of Jack, the story I just told you. I think it was the best thing I could do to be a friend. I think it was the best thing to do to honor the gift Jack had given me at such personal expense. So I tell it to you also. As a friend and in the memory of Jack, be careful what you are investing in. Thank you, Jack. Class dismissed.